Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you gave them not just your heart, but your soul, your faith, your very essence, only to watch them weaponize every sacred thing you believed in against you? Have you ever stood in a place meant for worship, for healing, for connection with the divine, and felt your spirit being crushed under the weight of manipulation, disguised as salvation? I have, and what I'm about to share with you will shake you to your core, because this isn't just my story. This is the story of countless others who have suffered in silence, trapped in the darkest corners of spiritual abuse where no one thinks to look, where no one believes it can happen, where the perpetrator wears a mask so convincing that even questioning them feels like blasphemy. My name doesn't matter as much as what happened to me, and more importantly, what I did with that pain. How I transformed the deepest betrayal of my life into a shield that now protects hundreds, maybe thousands of people from suffering the same fate I did. This is the story of how he used the altar to hurt me, how he twisted scripture and prayer into weapons of control, how he made me believe that my suffering was somehow holy, somehow part of a greater plan, and how I finally saw through the lies, broke free, and turned that excruciating pain into unstoppable power. Let me take you back to where it all began, to a version of myself I barely recognize anymore. A young woman filled with hope and faith, searching for meaning and connection in a world that often felt cold and disconnected. I had always been spiritual, always believed in something greater than myself, and I craved community. I craved belonging. I craved that feeling of being part of something divine and purposeful. When I walked into that church for the first time, I remember feeling an overwhelming sense of peace wash over me, the kind of peace I had been searching for my entire adult life. The music was beautiful, the people seemed genuine and warm, and when he stepped up to the pulpit to speak, I felt like I had finally found what I was looking for. He was charismatic in a way that seemed authentic, not flashy or performative, but deeply sincere and knowledgeable. He spoke about pain and redemption, about finding God in the darkest moments, about surrender and trust, and every word seemed to reach into my chest and touch something raw and vulnerable inside me. After the service, he made it a point to welcome newcomers personally, and when he shook my hand and looked into my eyes, I felt seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. He asked about my story, and I found myself opening up to him in ways I rarely did with strangers, telling him about my struggles, my doubts, my desperate search for purpose and peace. Over the following weeks and months, I became more involved in the church community, attending services regularly, joining small group meetings, volunteering for various activities and events. He seemed to take a special interest in my spiritual journey, offering to mentor me personally, to guide me through what he called my spiritual awakening. I was honored, I was grateful, I felt chosen and special. Our mentoring sessions started innocently enough, discussions about scripture, about applying faith to daily life, about prayer and meditation practices. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift. He started asking more personal questions, probing into my past traumas, my relationships, my deepest fears and insecurities. At first, I thought this was normal, that a spiritual mentor needed to understand these things to help me heal and grow. He assured me that everything we discussed was confidential, sacred even, a covenant between mentor and student under God's watchful eye. I trusted him completely because why wouldn't I? He was a man of God, a respected leader in the community, someone who had devoted his life to helping others find their way to salvation and peace. The manipulation was so gradual, so subtle, that I didn't recognize it as manipulation at all. He began to isolate me from other members of the congregation, suggesting that my spiritual journey was unique and required more personalized attention than group settings could provide. He convinced me that other people, even well-meaning friends and family, might not understand the depth of the work we were doing together, that they might inadvertently hinder my progress with their doubts and worldly concerns. I started pulling away from my support system, declining invitations from friends, keeping my family at arm's length, all because I believed I was doing something important, something transformative that required sacrifice and dedication. He introduced concepts that, looking back, were clear warning signs of spiritual abuse, but at the time seemed profound and enlightening. He talked about complete surrender, not just to God, but to the guidance of those God had placed in authority over me, meaning him. He spoke about dying to self in ways that required me to question my own thoughts, feelings, and instincts, to view them as obstacles to true faith rather than valid parts of my human experience. The sessions became more frequent and more intense. He insisted on meeting late in the evening when the church was empty, saying these were the sacred hours when we could commune with the divine without distraction. During these sessions, he would lead me through prolonged prayers that left me emotionally exhausted and vulnerable, breaking down my psychological defenses under the guise of breaking down barriers to spiritual enlightenment. He introduced fasting and sleep deprivation as spiritual practices, convincing me that physical discomfort was necessary to achieve spiritual clarity. My judgment became clouded, my sense of reality distorted. I was exhausted, emotionally depleted, and completely dependent on him for guidance and validation. He had successfully positioned himself as the sole interpreter of God's will for my life, and I had surrendered my autonomy so completely that I no longer trusted my own perception of right and wrong. Then came the moment that would define the next chapter of my life in the most horrific way imaginable. During one of our late-night sessions, he told me that God had revealed something to him in prayer, something about my path to redemption that would require ultimate trust and surrender. My heart was pounding, my hands were trembling, because some deep instinct inside me was screaming that something was wrong. But I had been so thoroughly conditioned to ignore my instincts, to view them as the enemy of faith, that I pushed down that warning voice and listened. He said that I was carrying a burden of past sins, of shame and guilt that was blocking my connection to the divine, and that the only way to cleanse myself was through a ritual he would perform, a sacred ceremony at the altar. The way he described it was cloaked in religious language and imagery, making it sound holy and necessary, but my body was responding with pure dread. Still, I agreed because I believed I had no choice, because he had convinced me that refusing would be refusing God himself. That night at the altar is seared into my memory, with a clarity that still takes my breath away years later. The church was dark except for candles he had lit around the altar, casting flickering shadows that made the familiar space feel foreign and menacing. He instructed me to kneel before the altar, to close my eyes, to pray for forgiveness and purification. His voice was different now, harder and more commanding, stripped of the gentle mentor persona he usually wore. What happened next is difficult for me to put into words even now, not because I don't remember every single detail, but because speaking it aloud makes it real in a way that still causes me physical pain. He used the altar, that sacred space meant for worship and reverence, as a stage for abuse. He used prayer as a weapon to keep me compliant and confused. He used scripture to justify actions that were the complete opposite of everything those texts actually taught. He violated my trust, my faith, my body, and my spirit in that place. And he did it all while invoking God's name, while framing his abuse as somehow divinely ordained. I left that church that night in a state of complete dissociation, my mind fractured and unable to process what had just happened. My body was there, walking to my car, driving home, but I wasn't really present. I was floating somewhere above myself, watching this broken person go through the motions of existing while everything inside screamed in agony and confusion. When I got home, I couldn't cry, I couldn't think, I couldn't do anything but sit in the darkness of my apartment staring at nothing. The days that followed were a blur of numbness punctuated by moments of searing emotional pain so intense I thought it would kill me. I wanted to tell someone. I wanted to scream from the rooftops what he had done, but he had spent months preparing for this possibility, building walls of shame and doubt inside my mind. He had convinced me that if I ever spoke about our spiritual work together, no one would believe me because I was troubled, because I was broken, because I was the one with the sinful past who needed salvation. He had positioned himself as the savior and me as the project. And who would believe the project over the savior? The spiritual abuse continued for months after that night because I was trapped, not by physical chains, but by psychological and spiritual ones that were just as real and just as strong. He had isolated me so completely that I had no one to turn to, no one who would understand or believe what I was experiencing. He had twisted my faith so thoroughly that I believed my suffering was somehow redemptive, somehow necessary, that God was testing me and I had to endure. Every time I tried to pull away, he would pull me back with a combination of threats disguised as concern, love bombing, and renewed promises of spiritual breakthrough just around the corner. He knew exactly which buttons to push, exactly how to keep me trapped in that cycle of abuse and false hope. The church community, the very people who should have been my protection and support, saw only what he wanted them to see: a dedicated mentor helping a troubled young woman find her way. No one questioned why we spent so much time alone together, why I had become so withdrawn and hollow-eyed, why I flinched at unexpected touches or sounds. Or maybe some people noticed and chose to look away, because confronting the truth would shatter the illusion of their safe, sacred community. Have you ever felt so completely powerless that you forgot you were ever powerful at all? That's where I was living. in a prison of shame and fear and twisted faith that seemed to have no walls but was impossible to escape. I stopped recognizing myself when I looked in the mirror. The vibrant, hopeful woman who had walked into that church seeking connection and meaning had been replaced by a shell, a ghost going through the motions of life while dying inside. I thought about ending it all more times than I can count because the pain was so overwhelming and the future seemed so impossibly dark. But something inside me, some tiny spark that he hadn't been able to completely extinguish, refused to let me give up. Maybe it was the memory of who I used to be, or maybe it was the beginning of who I was meant to become. But that spark kept me alive even when I didn't want to be. The breaking point came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, which seems almost absurd because you'd expect such a pivotal moment to happen during some dramatic confrontation or crisis. But real life isn't always theatrical like that. I was sitting in a coffee shop, mindlessly scrolling through my phone, when I came across an article about spiritual abuse in religious communities. As I read, my hands started shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone because every single thing described in that article was happening to me. Isolation from loved ones, check. Leader positioning themselves as sole interpreter of God's will, check. Using shame and guilt as control mechanisms, check. Sexual abuse disguised as spiritual practice, check, check, check. Seeing my experience reflected in those words, seeing that what was happening to me had a name, that it was a recognized pattern of abuse, something inside me cracked open. It was like I had been living underwater, drowning slowly, and suddenly I had broken the surface and could breathe again. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't sinful. I wasn't being tested by God. I was being abused, deliberately and systematically abused by someone who had weaponized my faith against me. That realization hit me like a freight train, and I sat in that coffee shop sobbing so hard that the barista came over to check if I was okay. But these weren't just tears of pain. They were tears of awakening, of rage, of determination. For the first time in months, I felt something other than numbness and despair. I felt anger, righteous burning anger at what had been done to me, at how my trust and faith had been violated and perverted. That anger became the fuel I needed to start fighting back, to start reclaiming my life and my power. I went home that day and did something I should have done months earlier, I told someone. I called my sister, whom I had been avoiding and keeping at a distance on his instructions, and I told her everything. Every horrible detail, every manipulation, every moment of abuse. She believed me immediately, without hesitation or judgment, and her belief in me became the foundation I needed to start rebuilding myself. Finding my voice was terrifying, because he had spent so long convincing me that my voice didn't matter, that my truth was flawed and sinful, that speaking out would only bring more pain. But I spoke anyway, first to my sister, then to a therapist who specialized in religious trauma, then to a lawyer who explained that what he had done wasn't just morally wrong but criminally prosecutable. Each time I told my story, I felt a little bit of my power returning, a little bit of the fog lifting, a little bit more like myself again. The therapist helped me understand the tactics he had used, helped me see how classic and predictable his manipulation had been, how I wasn't special or uniquely weak or foolish for falling into his trap, but rather how he was skilled at exploiting normal human needs for connection, meaning, and spiritual fulfillment. Understanding the psychology behind what had happened didn't erase the pain, but it did help me stop blaming myself, stop believing the lies he had planted in my mind about my own worthiness and value. Escaping completely required more than just physical distance. It required deprogramming years of psychological conditioning and reclaiming my understanding of faith and spirituality. I had to separate the beautiful, life-giving aspects of faith from the twisted, abusive version he had forced upon me. I had to learn that surrender to God didn't mean surrendering my autonomy or judgment to another human being, that questioning and boundaries weren't signs of weak faith, but of healthy faith, that my body and my instincts and my voice mattered, and were never meant to be sacrificed on the altar of someone else's power trip. This process was painful and slow, requiring me to examine every belief, every practice, every assumption I had built my spiritual life on, and determine what was authentic and what was implanted by him. Some days I felt like I was making progress, building something new and healthy, and other days I felt like I was back at square one, drowning in doubt and trauma responses. But I kept going, kept showing up for therapy, kept leaning on my sister and the few friends who had stuck by me, kept doing the hard work of healing even when it felt impossible. I reported him to church leadership, though I had little hope they would take meaningful action. I was right to be pessimistic. The initial response was defensive and protective of him rather than supportive of me. They questioned my account, suggested I had misunderstood his intentions, implied that I bore some responsibility for what had happened. This secondary trauma, this institutional betrayal, was almost as devastating as the original abuse because it confirmed what he had told me, that no one would believe me, that the institution would protect itself rather than protect victims. But I refused to let their failure silence me. I went to the police and filed a formal report, knowing that the legal system is notoriously difficult for victims of sexual assault, especially when religion and spiritual authority are involved, but determined to create an official record of what he had done. The legal process was brutal, requiring me to relive my trauma repeatedly, to have every detail questioned and scrutinized, to face his lawyers who tried to paint me as unstable, vindictive, and unreliable. There were days I wanted to give up, to withdraw my complaint and retreat back into anonymity and silence. But I kept going because I knew I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for everyone he had hurt before me, and everyone he would hurt in the future if I didn't stop him. And then something remarkable happened. 3 other women came forward with similar stories about him, women from previous churches he had worked at, women who had been carrying their own pain and shame in silence until they heard about my case and found the courage to speak up. Their testimony corroborated mine, established a pattern of predatory behavior spanning years and multiple communities. Together, our voices were strong enough to break through the walls of denial and institutional protection. He was eventually charged, tried, and convicted, sentenced to prison time for his crimes. The church where I had been abused finally acknowledged what had happened, issued a public apology, and implemented new policies for oversight and accountability. But these external victories, as important as they weren't what truly healed me. Healing came from the internal work, from rebuilding my sense of self and reclaiming my power, from learning to trust again, starting with trusting myself. Healing came from connecting with other survivors and realizing I wasn't alone, that spiritual abuse was far more common than most people realized, happening in churches and temples and spiritual centers across every faith tradition and denomination. Healing came from transforming my pain into purpose, from deciding that I would use my experience not as a life sentence, but as a launching pad for something meaningful and important. Rising from the ashes of that experience required me to reimagine my entire life and identity. I couldn't go back to being the naive, trusting person I was before. That version of me was gone forever, mourned and released. But I could become something new, something stronger and wiser and more compassionate because of what I had survived. I went back to school and studied psychology, specializing in trauma and religious abuse. I trained as a counselor and advocate, learning the skills I needed to help others navigate the complex aftermath of spiritual manipulation and abuse. I started speaking publicly about my experience, first in small support group settings where my voice would shake and my hands would tremble, then at conferences and workshops, then eventually on platforms that reached thousands of people. Each time I shared my story, someone would approach me afterwards with tears in their eyes saying, "That happened to me too," or, "I thought I was the only one," or, "You've given me hope that I can survive this." Turning my pain into purpose became my mission and my calling. I founded an organization dedicated to supporting survivors of spiritual abuse, providing counseling services, legal advocacy, educational resources, and safe community for people trying to rebuild their lives after religious trauma. We train church leaders and community members to recognize warning signs of spiritual abuse, to understand the tactics predators use, to create cultures of accountability and protection rather than enablement and cover-up. We lobbied for legal reforms to close loopholes that allowed abusers to hide behind religious authority and institutional protection. We partnered with other organizations fighting against all forms of abuse and exploitation, recognizing that these issues were interconnected and required comprehensive, collaborative solutions. The work was exhausting and often heartbreaking, bringing me into contact with story after story of pain and betrayal. But it was also deeply fulfilling because I could see the tangible impact we were having, lives being saved and transformed, predators being stopped, systems being changed. Every person we helped felt like a small victory against the darkness that had almost consumed me. Every survivor who found their voice and their power through our programs felt like proof that pain doesn't have to be the end of the story, that we can take the worst things that happen to us and forge them into tools for healing and change. I heard from people all over the world who had experienced similar abuse, who felt validated and supported by the resources we provided, who found hope and healing through our community. Some of them joined the cause themselves, becoming advocates and counselors and speakers, multiplying the impact exponentially. We created a network of survivors and allies who refused to let these abuses continue in silence, who insisted on accountability and justice, who worked tirelessly to protect vulnerable people from predators who weaponized faith and spirituality. My own healing journey continued alongside this work, the two processes intertwined and mutually reinforcing. Helping others helped me, reminding me constantly why I had survived, what I was meant to do with this second chance at life. I rebuilt my relationship with spirituality on my own terms, finding practices and communities that honored my autonomy and supported my wholeness rather than demanding my submission and sacrifice. I learned that true spiritual growth happens in environments of safety and freedom, not control and fear. I learned that God, or the divine, or whatever higher power exists, doesn't require us to be abused or diminished. That any teaching or practice that harms us is not from a holy source, no matter how much religious language surrounds it. I learned to listen to my body and my instincts, to honor my boundaries, to trust my own judgment about what feels right and what feels wrong. These lessons, bought at such a high price, became the foundation of everything I taught and shared with others. Years have passed since that night at the altar that nearly destroyed me, and I'm not going to tell you that I'm completely healed or that the trauma doesn't still affect me, because that would be a lie. There are still moments when something triggers a memory, and I'm transported back to that dark church. Still nights when I wake up from nightmares reliving those experiences. Still days when the weight of what happened feels almost too heavy to carry. But those moments are fewer and further between now, and when they come, I have tools and support systems to help me through them. More importantly, I have perspective. I can see how far I've come, how much I've grown, how something that was meant to break me forever actually became the catalyst for me becoming the strongest, most purpose-driven version of myself I never knew existed. The organization I founded has now helped thousands of survivors, providing counseling to over 5,000 people, assisting with legal advocacy in hundreds of cases, training over 10,000 religious leaders in abuse prevention and response, and reaching millions through our educational content and public awareness campaigns. We've contributed to policy changes at both state and federal levels, helped shut down multiple abusive religious organizations, and supported numerous survivors in their journeys toward justice and healing. These numbers represent real people, real lives changed, real futures reclaimed from the darkness of spiritual abuse. Every single one of them is a testament to the power of turning pain into purpose, of refusing to let trauma have the final word in our stories. But beyond the statistics and organizational achievements, what matters most to me is the individual connections, the moments when I sit across from a survivor who is at the beginning of their healing journey, still trapped in shame and confusion and pain, and I can look them in the eyes and say, I believe you, what happened to you was wrong. You didn't deserve it, and you're going to survive this. I promise you're going to survive this because I did, and you're stronger than you know. The look of hope that sparks in their eyes in that moment, the way their shoulders straighten slightly, the first deep breath they've taken in months, that's what it's all about for me. That's the moment when pain transforms into power, when the cycle of abuse begins to break, when healing becomes possible. I get to facilitate that moment over and over again, and it never gets old, never becomes routine, never stops feeling like the most important work I could possibly be doing with my life. I also spend time working on prevention, going into religious communities and educational settings to teach people how to recognize and resist spiritual manipulation before it escalates into abuse. I teach young people especially to trust their instincts, to understand that healthy spiritual authority never requires absolute obedience or surrender of autonomy, that questions and boundaries are signs of maturity, not disrespect, that their bodies and voices matter and should never be sacrificed in the name of faith or spiritual growth. I teach parents and community members to watch for warning signs, to take concerns seriously, to prioritize the safety and well-being of vulnerable individuals over the reputation of institutions or leaders. This preventative work is just as important as supporting survivors because every person we can protect from experiencing what I experienced is a victory. My life today looks nothing like I imagined it would back when I first walked into that church seeking connection and meaning, but in many ways it's richer and more purposeful than anything I could have envisioned back then. I've built a career around helping others, surrounded myself with a community of survivors and allies who inspire me daily with their courage and resilience, found my voice and learned to use it powerfully to speak truth and advocate for change. I've reclaimed my faith and spirituality in a form that nourishes rather than depletes me, that honors my humanity rather than demanding I transcend or deny it. I've learned what I'm capable of enduring and overcoming, discovered depths of strength I didn't know I possessed. None of this erases what happened to me. The abuse was real and the damage was real, and I carry scars that will never fully fade. But I refuse to let those scars define me, to let what he did to me determine what I become. Instead, I've chosen to let my survival and my healing define me, to let the work I do and the lives I touch become my legacy rather than the abuse I suffered. If you're watching this video and something in my story resonates with you, if you've experienced spiritual abuse or manipulation, or if you suspect someone you love is caught in that trap, please hear me when I say that you are not alone. You are not crazy, you are not to blame, and you can survive this. What happened to you was wrong, full stop, regardless of what the abuser told you, regardless of what the institution says, regardless of how much shame or confusion you carry. Your pain is valid, your truth matters, and there are people who will believe you and support you. Healing is possible, freedom is possible, a full and beautiful life on the other side of this darkness is possible. I'm living proof of that. It won't be easy and it won't be quick, but if you're willing to do the work, to reach out for help, to refuse to let trauma have the final word in your story, you can get there. You can transform your pain into power just like I did, just like thousands of others have done. Your survival and your healing could become the thing that protects and inspires countless others, creating ripple effects of change that extend far beyond what you can imagine right now. I want to hear from you in the comments, whether you're a survivor ready to share your story, or someone who has questions about how to support a loved one, or just someone moved by this message who wants to be part of the solution. Tell me what resonated with you, what questions you have, what you need to hear right now. This community we're building together is powerful precisely because we refuse to suffer in silence anymore, because we're committed to speaking truth and supporting each other and demanding change. Your voice matters, your story matters, your presence in this community matters. And if you found value in this video, if my story touched your heart, or opened your eyes, or gave you hope, please leave a like to help this content reach more people who need to hear this message. The algorithm only amplifies content that people engage with, so your like isn't just a nice gesture, it's a tangible way to help protect and empower others by ensuring this video reaches them. And please subscribe to I Live to Tell for more stories of survival, resilience, and transformation. This channel is dedicated to sharing real stories from real people who have overcome unimaginable challenges and come out stronger on the other side. We don't shy away from difficult topics, we don't minimize pain or offer easy answers. We tell the truth about what survival looks like in all its messy, complicated, beautiful reality. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that could change your perspective, inspire your courage, or save someone's life. Thank you for being here, for listening, for caring, for being part of the solution. Together, we're creating a world where spiritual abuse can't hide in the shadows anymore, where survivors are believed and supported, where predators are held accountable, and where faith and spirituality can be what they're meant to be, sources of healing and connection and growth, rather than weapons of control and harm. Your presence here matters more than you know. Stay strong, stay connected, and remember that you are never alone in this fight.